good morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is about the state of Africa's young democracy and its governments. And this has to do with a seminar organized by the Africa Progress Group at Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. And this seminar had a keynote speaker who also happens to be the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, where Olusegun Obasanjo made some serious comments with regards to the state of Africa's young democratic governments and its governance and so on and so forth. But fellas, let's go ahead and hear what the former president of Nigeria had to say with regards to the state of Africa's young democracies.
Have a system of government in which we have no hands to design, and we continue with it even when we know that it is not working for us. Those who brought it to us are now questioning the rightness of their invention, its deliverability, and its relevance today without reform. The essence of any system of government is the welfare and the well-being of the people, all the people. Here, we must interrogate performance of democracy in the West where it originated from.
All right, fellas, you just heard the comments made by the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, with regards to the state of Africa's young democracy. But fellas, I strongly disagree with what former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, had to say with regards to Western influence democracies and so on and so forth. And why is this so? First of all, democracies, as we know, the basic core tenets of democracies is universal. Every democracy has basic core tenets, and those core tenets are universal. So it doesn't matter whether it's a democracy in America or democracy in Europe or democracy in Africa. If you really believe in true democracy, then the core tenets, which are the foundation of a real democracy, has to be universal. They have to be the same. It is not different with the belief that every human being has the right to live their life, to be happy, have life, liberty, and so on and so forth. Now, let me quote the Independence Declaration speech made by Thomas Jefferson that basically became the foundation of America's Constitution and America's democratic principles that all countries around the world today are practicing. So if you're talking about the core tenets of every democracy, you cannot divide it from what Thomas Jefferson said about 400 years ago during the Independence Day Declaration speech. Here we go. What did he say? He said, "We hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And he also went on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, and government derives its just powers from the governed. it derives its just powers from the governed, which is the people. And this is from Thomas Jefferson, the founding father of the American Constitution. And this is what basically he stated. He said during America's independence from England. So he stated by making it clear that all human beings are created equal. And we derive our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness from our Creator. So basically, we, the people, form a government. It is we who form the government. But our freedoms, our liberty, and our pursuit of happiness is derived from our Creator. But when we form a government, it is that government that we form that we create the kind of government that we want. So if you look at the basic tenets of every democratic society, you have these three things, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't change whether you are in America or you are in Europe or you are in any part of the world that wants to practice true democracy. These are the basic tenets of democratic principles. And then you come to the governing principles of democracy. And that is what basically Obasanjo is talking about, where I think he's wrong. Because when you talk about the principles, foundation of a democratic society, after talking about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, then you talk about rule of law. And that is what Thomas Jefferson also said, that the government is instituted by men. So it is the people that create this government. And under this government is what gives you the right to vote, the right to assemble peacefully, the right to petition your government with your grievances, and the right to elect your representatives and your leaders. And this is the bedrock, one of the key bedrocks of a democratic society. And out of this right to vote, right to elect your government, everything, when you form these governments, that is when you institute what? The rule of law. And that rule of law becomes the bedrock, that becomes the key foundation of your democracy. Because you can never have a real democracy without a rule of law, period. You can never have a democracy without rule of law. So rule of law becomes the key bedrock, the key foundation to every true democratic society, period. And that is what it is. So you go from life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which is the God-given, that is given to you by your Creator. And that is what Thomas Jefferson said during the Independence Declaration speech. Those are the key tenets of it. And it was given to you by your Creator. That one was not given to you by government. It is given to you by your Creator. And it is out of that these people who have been given these rights and liberty and pursuit of happiness by their Creator also what? Institute government. And the government derives its power from these very people. So when you talk about Western democracies or African democracy and so on and so forth, there's nothing different when it comes to the key tenets, the core foundation of every democratic society. Democratic core foundation of a democratic society is universal. Every human being on this planet wants to have life, liberty, and happiness. It doesn't matter whether you live in America, or you live in China, you live in Nigeria, or you live in Congo, or you live in Togo, or anywhere on this planet. Every human being have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But it is the creation of government that is instituted by men that has to be on the foundation of these three things: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And out of that comes with the governed giving these powers to the government to institute them, which brings about the rule of law. And then the foundation of that democratic principles sits on this rule of law, which basically governs the principles that have been established by the society. So if Olusegun Obasanjo is talking about the Western style democracies coming to Africa has failed and so on and so forth, and Africa has to chart its own form of democracy, yes, at some point, democracies does not become universal when it gets to the level of society in terms of culture and those things. You have to create your democracy to blend it with the culture of your society. Certain things that can be done in Africa are not done in Western democracies, which is understandable. But at the end of the day also, the key and the core tenets, which are the bedrock of every democratic society, are always going to be universal. The right to elect your leaders, the right to assemble peacefully and petition your government with your grievances, the right to choose your leaders, the right to vote, the right to free speech. All these things are key tenets, are the key bedrock tenets of every key democratic society. But when it comes to how these laws are come about in terms of certain laws with regards to cultures and so on and so forth, that is what every country has to look at its culture and its citizens and the society as a whole and make decisions based on how these things can be infused into your democratic systems, your constitution, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing wrong with Western style democracy. After all, it was the Western world, America, that gave this modern world all these democratic principles that these worlds are all practicing today. The kind of democracy that is being practiced in Europe is not the same as that being practiced in America. America have what they call the Second Amendment, the right to own a gun. Europeans don't have the same in their constitution. They have different because of the way Europe is. So at the end of the day, you have a society like in America where they have what? Monogamous relationship in marriages, which is embedded in their constitution, in their laws. You come to most African countries, or pretty much every African country, we have a polygamous society. So these are things that we have to infuse into our systems of government. So when you talk about Afro-democracy, like Obasanjo is talking about, yes, I get it. We have to have certain things that has to be part of our democratic systems that are different from what is going on in Western Europe, America, and other parts of the world, which is understandable because that is how democracies are. You have to implement your democratic principles and democratic systems based on your culture as well. These are part of the things that you have to do when you talk about democracy. You can never have a democratic society without taking into consideration the people that are being governed in terms of the culture and the society as a whole. You have to have that. So when you talk about Afro-democracy and so on and so forth, that is all well and good. But at the end of the day, the core tenets, which is the bedrock of every real democracy, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that was said by Thomas Jefferson at America's independence, is universal. That is universal to every society, period. Because at the end of the day, every society aspires to have that in life. So those are key tenets of every real democracy. When you talk about rule of law, as well as the right to elect your leaders, the right to assemble peacefully, free speech, and so on and so forth. These are things that you can never devoid them from a real democracy. That has to be part of it. So those are the key tenets that every democratic society have to have, whether you're in Africa, Europe, or Asia. But when it comes to certain things that has to be applied to your systems, then you have to look at your culture, your society as a whole, and then use that and infuse it into the key democratic principles so that it will work for your people. So even in Africa, certain things can be done democratically, infused into the constitution of Nigeria, that might not be the same with that of South Africa or maybe Congo or Egypt because of differences of cultures. So even with Afro democracy, there are still going to be differences in terms of certain things that are being implemented in different parts of Africa that might be different from other parts of Africa, which is understandable. That is why democracy, the key tenet, core tenet of every democratic society are always going to be universal. They're always going to be uniform. When you talk about the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and those things, those are God-given rights. They are going to be uniform. But outside of that, in terms of the laws that comes with it, then that one are going to be different based on the cultures and societies that these things are being implemented in. So, but for him to say that African democracy has failed because of Western influence, African democracy hasn't failed because of Western influence. African democracy has failed because of corruption as well as bad governance and lack of rule of law. Like I stated before, and I'm going to state it today too. You can never have a real democratic system of government without rule of law. You have to have rule of law as the basic bedrock foundation of a real true democracy. And most African countries, if not all African countries, don't have rule of law. So the key reason why African countries' democracies have failed is not because of Western influenced democracies, Mr. Obasanjo. The key reasons why African democracies have failed is because of bad governance, high level of corruption, and as well as what? Lack of rule of law. Lack of institutions, genuine institutions to implement policies that are within the constitutions of these various African countries as well as the rule of law. And if you don't have rule of law, you can never have a true democracy. Give me rule of law and I'll take that. And I won't bother to even think about voting for elected officials and all that stuff. Because when you have rule of law, it gives you everything that you need in a democratic society. But if you don't have rule of law, you don't have a democratic society. So when we talk about the failures of African democracy, it is not because of Western influenced democracies, liberal democracies. It is because of the lack of rule of law. It is because of the level of corruption. It is because of bad governance. That is why African democracies have failed. It hasn't failed because of the influence of Western liberal democracies. Western liberal democracies have their own thing going. You can choose to adapt them or you can choose to leave them. You don't have to adapt everything from the West. And we have adapted some things from them, which are very good. But at the end of the day, that is not the reason why we have bad governance in our countries. We have bad governance in our country because of lack of rule of law. Because we don't have credible leaders. We don't have leaders that are prepared to sacrifice for the welfare of their fellow African citizens. We have corrupt leaders. We have corrupt political structure systems that basically have become the reasons why most African countries are indebted today because of the level of corruption tied to these political so-called democratic parties in most various African countries. So if we are going to talk about the issue of democracy in Africa, please, let's not get this twisted. Let's not make it seem that the influence of Western liberal democracy is the reason why we Africans are where we are. Let's be real. It has nothing to do with the Western liberal democracies. It all has to do with bad governance, high level of corruption, as well as bad leaderships. And that is why we are at this stage in terms of our democratic so-called democracies and so on and so forth. And we are not going nowhere. As far as we have this kind of leaderships in our various African countries, the level of corruption, fraudulent leaders, corrupt leaders, bad governance, Talking about liberal style democracies can be introduced to Africa. Is it the Western liberal democracy that tells a country like Nigeria, where legislators today have proposed buying vehicles for their legislators that they will use while they are in office, and in about 10 years have the option of buying those vehicles that are being bought for them to be for official business today? Well, what Western democracy that does Obasanjo know of today that does that? What Western democracy does that? You go to Europe, you go to America, no American government never and never has ever even bought a bicycle for a legislator in the name of using it for official business. And when they leave office in about 10 years, they have the option to buy that bicycle back. So if you are implementing these policies in your various African countries, looking at the level of indebtedness in your various African countries, look at the level of poverty, look at the level of suffering by your citizens, and then you pass legislation that is going to give your legislators, your elites, your congressmen, the right to own cars that are being purchased by the government. What has that got to do with Western liberal democracies on your system of government? It is you that are implementing these policies. So when we're talking about Western liberal democracies and what they have done to African democracies, let's be clear. We Africans have the choice and the right to decide what kind of democracy that we're going to have based on our cultures and society. But at the end of the day, when you talk about the level of corruption, the level of abuses, human rights abuses, and so on and so forth going on in our various African countries, that has nothing to do with Western liberal democracies. So let's cut that out, fellas. Let's not buy into that nonsense. The truth of the matter is that we have bad governance, bad government, corrupt governments, no rule of law, and those are the basic tenets of every core democracy. And as far as we don't have rule of law, we can never have a true democracy. So I'm sorry, Mr. Obasanjo. Have a nice week, fellas, and God bless you guys. Peace and love.